Digitally accessible. Digital accessibility simplified.
Hi, this is Juan Olarte from Digitally Accessible. Welcome to our Accessibility One-on-One podcast series. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Today, I have Gareth Ford Williams and Charlie Turrell join us to talk about usability and user experience. Charlie and Gareth, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting.
Can you guys tell us a little bit about you?
Charlie, you go first.
Happily. So currently I work as the Accessibility Champions Manager at the BBC. I've been there for a few years now. The Champions Programme has about 250 people in it. So it allows us in the accessibility team currently to have a wider reach across the organisation. So I manage that group of people. We look after testing and research. And on the side, I also run the Champions of Accessibility group, which allows companies from all across the world to discuss champions networks, accessibility, and how we can improve all of our services for any audience that we serve.
Excellent. Right. And myself, Gareth Ford Williams. If you're not familiar with me and what I do, so I set up the accessibility team back at the BBC back in 2005, which was the start of my accessibility journey. Currently I write a lot about accessibility, talk a lot, love talking about it, which I'm going to do quite a bit in a minute. And currently I'm a director along with Charlie at ably.com, and we are a inclusive design and accessibility data company.
And thank you so much. I really appreciate the introductions. And we're going to get to Ably in a minute. But maybe to both of you, if you guys can tell me a little bit some of the challenges that you have experienced in the past with other organizations when it comes to integrating accessibility into a project, it'll be great. And maybe we can put it a little bit in terms of a gateway to what you're doing with Ably right now. So maybe some of those challenges, what do you have to do to overcome them, and why it's important to make sure that things are accessible for people with disabilities?
Yeah, I'm happy to go first of that one if you want, Gareth.
Sure.
Yeah. So for me in the BBC at the minute, I think the challenges are, well, what I face personally is trying to explain the lenses that we use, especially in the accessibility team. So we try and kind of move away from the medical model and look at the social model of disability. So we kind of look at it from everybody's uses, everybody's barriers and environments, rather than looking at it from a specific group of people. So having to kind of explain that to people and get them to really think about it from a different point of view.
It's not about putting responsibility on people or turning around and saying you're a champion, you're now responsible for delivery. It's just making sure it's never off the table. And that's the main thing I think that I've always taken from this kind of thing, and keeping those channels going, keeping that conversation alive, and you find that parts of the organization start helping others, and it gets the silos that our organizations all have.
I was going to say, it's you start to see these little groups of people that all of a sudden they're going, oh yeah, we've got our meeting at 10 o'clock on Monday, we're talking about testing, or oh, we're looking at Android users for this particular app, and they've made a little iPlayer group where everyone starts to discuss really in the detail things that they're really enjoying, and that being able to make accessibility fun, especially the fact that it's such a huge topic and things change all the time, doing that, I think takes the pressure off. You have to know everything, and actually goes, this is a really unusual and interesting topic. How can we all talk about it and improve the user's experience?
I completely agree, and I can attest of that. I have worked with big organizations that don't do much about accessibility, and it's difficult for somebody who's just that only one person, or like you mentioned, Charlie, like you having the small team to try to support accessibility enterprise-wide. Meanwhile, you have like thousands, if not tens of thousands employees. But I have been on those other organizations where you may have a smaller accessibility team between 5 to 10, but they're creating that type of network within the same organization. So you're creating allies. It's not going to be that just one group always talking about accessibility and like Gareth saying, oh, putting the blame on of another team, but rather, hey, how can we include accessibility early on within the development life cycle so everybody can benefit? And you talk
Absolutely.
about a few great things, which are the lenses for accessibility. But I want to touch on that. But I think what I want to do is maybe first, if you can talk to us a little bit about Ably, what you do and how you help organizations in terms of data, because I want to bring that conversation back to the different lenses of accessibility and how we can utilize that data. But I'll let you guys go and talk to us a little bit about Ably. Yeah.
Able is pretty much one of those. It's the reason I left the BBC. There were a few things that I wanted to find out. It was kind of a weird experiment. Me going, I've been there 17 years, and we built the guidelines. We'd built documentation-driven development system around it, so people didn't have to use guidelines. Everything was on the component level. We were doing tons of stuff in gaming and all sorts of stuff, and with the Champions Network. And I always wondered whether it would all survive if I went. It's when you're there for a while, and the only way you're going to find out is by leaving. The ultimate experiment. And it's amazing. I mean, the culture it's an extraordinary organization, and the culture will mean it will never stop, and the people will mean it will never stop. And and the conversation is never based on why do we do this. It's always about how, and it's always about improvement. And I think that's always that kind of thing where you think, kind of, my work here is done, because no one is ever selling it again. They're constantly exploring it and trying to improve it. But there was this one big thing that I set up the accessibility team, I set up the design research team, but there was one, we could do all sorts of stuff. So we had our guidelines and guidance, documentation, tons of training, and we were embedding inclusion into design research practices in all of the qualitative work. But the one big problem that we had was evaluating the impact. Here is an enormous organization. Its reach in the UK, its share of the market, whatever, is the same size as Facebook in the UK. It's enormous. And internationally, about 1 billion users in 44 languages, which is the International News Service, plus commercial subsidiaries, masses of applications, etc. And so the estate is enormous. It's absolutely enormous. I know up to a few years ago, it was still the largest original content producer outside of China, and because it produces everything itself. It's so all of that, because of the breadth of it. They may be bigger now, but I don't know. But I'm pretty sure it must be still up there in the top 5 in the world. But so keeping tabs on this is a real nightmare thing to do. And when the senior management would ask me, how is it going, I always found that as a very difficult question. And I could say, well, we're doing this. I could show them activities, and I could say, well, we're delivering against our guidelines, and the BBC's guidelines are slightly different to WCAG. They're very much more specific to the types of products it does. It fills in a lot of gaps, has stuff that is not included in WCAG at all because of the nature of what the BBC does. And it's also about, it's a there's no AAA, AAA. It's just these are all the guidelines, and we never fall below them. They are a minimum standard that is a reflection of what is already delivered. So when something new is delivered and it becomes, standard across what's doing, it's captured in the standard, so it's and guidelines, so it's never lost. And so it becomes, that's the floor. But that's not what we settle for. We settle for design research led, thinking led work. But I could always turn around and say the biggest problem we had was that evaluation is never having any empirical data that said, actually, is everyone having a comparative experience? Is there equivalence within this? Are we delivering stuff that where it should be fun is fun for everyone? Or is it just fun for some and accessible for others? And accessible doesn't equal fun. It's always that thing about WCAG. We've got perceivable, operable, understandable, robust, but it doesn't say enjoyable anywhere in it. And yet these days we have social networks, collaborative platforms, live events, we have long form streaming, online games. It's all got to be enjoyable. And for a large sort of entertainment organization like the BBC, it's not just news, it's a big entertainment provider. That has to be there. And we just didn't know, and we didn't have a way of evaluating it. I never had the bandwidth to tackle the problem, and that was one of those things, that unanswered questions. And talking to lots of other people who are running accessibility programs at scale, it seems like nobody else has that data either. Nobody else has that kind of evaluation where they can turn around and saying, yeah, it is inclusive. And so, you know, I contacted initially Michael Matthews, who's one of the directors, and we started talking about this. And there was another study that we were doing with another group, wonderful people, called Readability Group, and we were doing a study last year around font accessibility. And then we started asking the question, can we use the same kind of tools that we're doing? Can we redesign them for websites and for mobile applications and games and enterprise systems? And so then I got Charlie involved. I brought Ian Pouncey in, who's, you know, and Michael Southgate, who's the ex-director of compliance from Google. And because it's always good when you're dealing with data is to have a really good lawyer who understands law on your board. And it was like, can we fix this? Can we design this? And so we built algorithms. We built a way of segmentation via human need and preference, and started realizing that this is doable. It's just we just needed time to be able to sort of sit down and actually explore it. And that's what Ably is become. It's you know, the idea is to provide data to organizations that provide services around accessibility that enable their clients to be able to evaluate and monitor the impact of the work that they're doing from a sort of accessibility and inclusive design lens perspective. Yeah.
So using those accessibilities and inclusive design lens, and in terms of getting the data, what are some of the things that organizations are able to do, or how they're going to be able to improve the different products or digital assets? I don't know if you have some examples on that.
I've got, well, we've had a lot of very interesting conversations that have gone from, because this thing is, this type of data just simply hasn't existed before, simply because there's a lot of there are some. This is again why, you know, having a lawyer help you design something, you understand, you know, sort of what you need to consider around GDPR and personal data, etc. You need to make sure that you're not collecting personal data. You're making sure it's you know, the separation is there and anonymity, and people cannot be reverse engineered, but our identities can't be. But the thing is, the kind of data that then this gives you, it enables you to understand when you do deliver something, you know, when you are making changes, is how is that impacting on the needs of different segments within your audience. So for instance, a need could be around language accessibility, so the need for human centric plain English or whatever language that it is delivered in, that is usable and understandable by the, you know, everybody. And when you look at that as a need, when it comes to, you know, potentially presenting barriers to people, you can then, you know, it's a massively shared need from people who may, if it's an English language product or service, you know, people who speak English as a second language, people who are dyslexic, people who've got other cognitive conditions, people who may have learning disabilities, age-related cognitive disabilities. They may have lower literacy levels because of, you know, socioeconomic opportunity. You know, you're talking a third, particularly if the UK on the statistics, you add all of those groups together, it's a third of the population have that as a need, and if it's not met, that could present as a barrier which could stop them being your customers. They will go elsewhere if they cannot understand how to use it because the language is obtuse or difficult, or they can't navigate or whatever. You need that information. And it's understanding, you know, sort of what we do is being able to evaluate needs groups, and there are many needs groups that are intersectional in that way, and then understand whether the UX is delivering what those needs groups, are people having good experiences, or are they struggling? If users, customers struggle, they don't tend to be very loyal. You know, this is one of those things. If people have good experiences, they tend to come back. And we all have needs, and that's the thing is, you know, this is the thing around inclusion. You know, it's we all have various different needs, and it's getting to that kind of understanding of that within your audience is so important.
Yeah, I think from when we're looking at accessibility as a whole, it's having a needle in a haystack moment, isn't it? You know, when you're looking at, you know, is my website accessible? Where do you start? You know, what area do you look at? How do you know if something's working for your customers or if it's not? So having this data just helps you be able to point in the right direction. What is it that we can start working on at the beginning? Where can we start learning? And just being able to focus on that and then go, right, did we do it? You know, is it actually improving this service? Before that, you do it with a couple of people, you test it out. But again, when you're talking about the social model of disability, like it's everybody. So for me personally, you know, I'm a subtitle user. I'm not hard of hearing, I'm not deaf, but I use it because I've got ADHD and I find it easier to read the words and hear what's going on at the same time. But if you were doing testing with subtitles, you wouldn't necessarily include me in that group of people that you were testing with. Whereas in this way, you're testing with all these different kinds of people and people that are using the service in a particular way that you might not even realize that is how they're using it. So again, having this data, having able to run that and having a look at your website, you can have a look at that and go, right, okay, so for this particular group of users who there might be crossovers there, that, you know, they're not particularly enjoying that area of the site, but this way, you know, we're obviously really good at this particular area and that's wonderful. And it just gives you that starting point with accessibility.
I mean, qualitative research and auditing, etc., always become one of those interesting things when you start because you don't know where to start, particularly on a large estate or within a product. It's like, what do you pick? You can't do everything. And if you're going to do a deep dive, and if you have this kind of data, it will tell you where things are going wrong and for whom potentially around the UX, and it will say, right, you need to go. There's obviously something going on, and the inspiration of it came from the finance industry. Interestingly enough, it's kind of, you know, the way that they look at transactional data. You know, you can't have an accountant look at every transaction that's going on within a bank because there are billions of them happening all the time. So you have algorithms, which is like the algorithms we built around need, to evaluate, you know, sort of different sort of transactional patterns and bank accounts. And it kind of then focuses it down and says, look, there's something over here that needs a person to look at. There's something going wrong here. And we need to go and have a look at that and investigate that. They get so much more value out of what they're investing in the other kind of processes because it helps them target it and it helps them, you know, deliver. Whereas if you just pick, you know, a dozen random pages, even if it's that many across your estate and do an audit of it, which takes weeks, how do you know they're the right dozen? How do you know you know, where the things that where actually that's the stuff that we need to be focusing on because something's going wrong there, or this is the team that seems to be struggling against this other team because you're running, you know, two studies on two comparative products, and so do they need training because this one seems to be getting well and that one doesn't, and there's so many different ways that you can utilize data to bring more value out of the services that you're already investing in.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. One of the things I've come across, well, accessibility is both a science and an art. I believe that when done well, it helps everybody. But when you don't do it well, it actually affects people with disabilities by creating barriers. You mentioned one thing that I think is super important, and also as the data becomes more usable, I think organizations are going to be able to use it properly. One thing is, especially in North America, accessibility is very reactive rather than proactive. And we all know that including accessibility early on within the development life cycle is not only going to help people with disabilities, but it's going to help everybody by ensuring that your products are your projects run smoothly. Many times they hit targets because you are more informational when creating requirements. However, people don't see it like that. Unfortunately, it is driven by legislation, but having a company like yours where we're going to actually be able to deliver data, and what is the power of the data? How can we actually utilize it to say, listen, people with disabilities are using your products, but your products are not considering those people with disabilities. In fact, they're excluding so many users. I think that's really, really powerful.
Yeah, I think it's very, very useful. You know, you can deliver the stuff around compliance, but you still need to know if you're a bank, if, for instance, that people were still able to set up an account, they were able to log in, they were able to navigate. Because compliance does not give you usability, and then still you have an American with Disabilities Act issue. If someone you can build a completely compliant site, and and someone can still not be able to perform the function. So you need the two pieces of data together. I mean, you've got something that's so solid because you can not only prove that you're compliant, you can prove that you've done it effectively. And then that stops, so that becomes kind of rock solid. And it's the same with Section 508. I find fascinating as a for American government sites particularly, because it has the word usable in it. And so it doesn't just deal with compliance. It says within the act itself that it should always be usable. And evidencing that up to now has been pretty much, I've not come across anyone that's been able to actually provide any concrete evidence against that word. And so they fall back on compliance. And I think this is an opportunity now to explore whether we can actually deliver against that word.
Well, we said, didn't we, at the BBC, we were asked once when we were doing a webinar, and they said, how do you know that everything's working? How do you know that, the Champions program's actually great? We kind of looked at each other and said, well, it's, the level of complaints we get. And that was literally the only way that we can manage to go, this is how we know it's working or not. Whereas if we ran this against all the BBC systems and it came back and they said, they're actually having a problem with this particular site in this area, and I noticed there that, let's say there's no champions in that area, I've done no meetups about that particular topic, there's not an awful lot of resources around that, I can kind of see that straight away and go, right, I know where to focus my efforts now for a couple of months. And even though in that particular area I might never have received complaints, it doesn't really matter. There's other services out there. I can go to Netflix, I can go to all these different areas, and I'll just not use that particular thing at the BBC. So the compliance, we could be ticking all the boxes, but we're not particularly usable. So having this data just helps not only whoever's running a Champions network, or if you're starting one, to be able to direct their efforts. It helps people that are actually, promoting the product, working on the product, doing a level of testing. It helps all these different areas of groups to have all this additional information.
Yeah, I mean, testing is a really important thing there, Charlie. You can use this data as multivariate testing. You can use it in regression testing. This exactly the same kind of profiling and surveys can be used in a multitude of ways to make sure. And I think we're moving into an agile world as well. More and more organizations are becoming agile, but even when they're in that kind of situation, it's very, very, you need data. You need the data about what the UX is now, not the history of it. We don't want to know what it was like 6 weeks ago. We need to know what it was like. It's like, this yesterday. And because we're releasing code all the time, and every time you release code, you potentially change the UX. You impact the UX some way, because the UX is code is UX. The two things are inextricably linked. And so if you can run things on a regular basis, and when something changes within the user data, and which is what the point of Ably is, you can then turn around and say, what did we do? Where did that change? Did it go better? Did it go worse? Can we see what happened? And it gives you this kind of ongoing way of evaluating the impact of the work that you're outputting. And what you want to see is those numbers improving. And I think this is that whole thing, is it shifts more into the worthwhileness of accessibility. And I think, it will finally give us the kind of the numbers and the data that will actually turn around and saying, doing this work positively impacts on, and you can show it, you can evaluate.
I think it's great, and it's going to be able to provide, especially when we're providing a service to an organization, real hard evidence in terms of this is why you should be accessible, and this is your bottom line. It's actually going to help you generate revenue. Not only that you're going to be doing the right thing, it's actually going to help your business. Charlie and Gareth, I want to really thank you so much for being here with us today. It was a fantastic talk. I think we can keep talking forever, and for sure we're going to invite you for our next talk. But I really appreciate you being part of Accessibility 101 today.